This is a guest essay written by Daniel Greenfield, a Shillman Journalism Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
Newsweek magazine asked in a headline, "Deporting the hope for peace?" The quote-unquote hope for peace was Hamas. The year was 1992. Then U.S. President Bill Clinton's administration had been trying to get Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin to sign on the dotted line of the peace process to create a so-called Palestinian state. But Palestinian terrorists wouldn't stop killing Israelis. 15-year-old Helena Rapp was stabbed to death at a bus stop on the way to school. Several days later, Rabbi Shimon Biran, a father of four, was murdered by an Islamic terrorist. Fed up with the latest killings, Rabin put 417 Islamists terrorists, including top Hamas leaders, on buses and dumped them in Lebanon. On the 6 buses were eventual Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, who Israel assassinated in Iran last year, Hamas co-founder Abdelaziz al-Rantisi, who would vow, "By Allah, we will not leave one Jew in Palestine," Abu Osama, who helped draft the Hamas charter calling for the extermination of the Jews, Hamas co-founders Mohammed Taha, Hamad al-Hassanat, and Mahmoud Zahar, who threatened, "They have legitimized the killing of their people all over the world by killing our people," Hamad al-Batawi, who proclaimed that jihad is a collective duty, Abdullah al-Shami, the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and many other present and future Islamic terror leaders. The New York Times headlined its coverage with, quote, "Ousted Arabs shiver and wait in Lebanese limbo." Newsweek also sympathetically described how the Hamas terrorists were, quote, "shivering in the cold." The Washington Post lingered on their handcuff welts. The Associated Press provided detailed coverage of their cases of diarrhea, turning the bowel movements of Islamist terrorists into an item worthy of international coverage. In reality, these Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists had been equipped by Israel with raincoats, blankets, food, and $50 each, more than enough to buy whatever they needed in Lebanon. The New York Times began its story with a quote from Dr. Abdul Aziz Rantisi, who said, quote, "We are thirsty, cold, and hungry." It mentioned that Rantisi was planning a hunger strike, not that he was a terrorist leader. The Los Angeles Times suggested that the, quote, free speech of the terrorists had been violated. It asked them to, quote, define Hamas's membership conditions, and many answered, to pray and be good Muslims. That is how the media explained the Islamic terror groups to their vast audiences. Meanwhile, the Red Cross, which failed to visit the Israeli hostages, including children and old women being held by Hamas, was quickly on the scene with 3 truckloads of tents, food, blankets, and bedding. The aid organization set up tents for the Hamas terrorists, who were apparently too lazy or incompetent to set up their own tents. The head of UNRWA, the United Nations Agency for so-called Palestinian refugees, trekked out from Vienna to visit the expelled Hamas terrorists. Bernard Pfefferle, the local chief delegate of the International Committee of the Red Cross, wept, saying, quote, "They won't survive the winter out there like this. In fact, they survived just fine." UN. Undersecretary General James O.C. Jonah, French Minister for Humanitarian Affairs, Bernard Kouchner, and many other foreign dignitaries tried to visit the Hamas terrorists. French Ambassador to Lebanon Daniel Hussein asked to meet with the Hamas terrorists to, quote, express France's sympathy with their cause. Amnesty International organized a letter-writing campaign whining that the Hamas deportees were, quote, living in tents in freezing conditions, and demanding the, quote, safe return of the deportees to Israel. B'Tselem, a pro-terror so-called human rights group operating inside Israel, denounced the deportations as, quote, a flagrant violation of human rights. During the October 7th attacks, Canadian-Israeli Vivian Silver, a B'Tselem board member, was murdered in the Kibbutz Be'eri massacre by the Palestinian terrorists, for whom she had spent her life advocating. B'Tselem had been one of the pro-terrorist groups that had originally challenged the deportations in Israel's leftist Supreme Court in a bid to keep Hamas inside Israel. The media relentlessly covered the Hamas deportees the way it had failed to cover their victims. By the end, Abdelaziz al-Rantisi had held a record of 1,500 press conferences. Every time the Islamic terrorists sneezed, there was a correspondent there to write about it, a photographer there to take a picture of it, and a human rights activist there to condemn Israel for it, even if it was all a lie. Expelled Palestinians run out of water, a Washington Post headline blared. In this same story, the newspaper mentioned that they were getting their water from a stream. Other stories complained that they were running out of water while surrounded by snow. One Associated Press piece described a deportee eating a breakfast of jam, cheese, and bread, or beans and chickpeas with lemon sauce, and then a lunch of tuna fish or sardines, and then complaining, quote, "I'm so sick of this food. I eat only to stay alive." In reality, the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists had plenty of food and water. At one point, even a New York Times article admitted that, quote, "On Thursday, the Palestinians said that they had fasted during the day to preserve food stocks that had dwindled to some vermicelli and potatoes, with drinking water completely gone. Yet today, an Associated Press reporter said that the deported men were cooking rice, chickpeas, and canned meat, and that some had eggs." A week after they were deported, the New York Times claimed that the terrorists would start, quote, "dying from pneumonia in a few days." None of them died even after 7 months. In reality, they were holding lavish religious feasts with Hezbollah and Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps terrorists. The tent city would become an enclave of television sets, fax machines, copy machines, cell phones, a fridge filled with soda, and a satellite dish beaming Iranian television shows to them. Israel had dumped the Hamas terrorists in Lebanon, but the Hezbollah-allied government refused to take them and blocked the road with tanks to keep them from leaving. The Lebanese government wouldn't allow aid to pass through to the terrorists, but did allow reporters and camera crews through to document their quote-unquote shivering. In a foreshadowing of Egypt's policy of blockading Gaza, Lebanon kept the terrorists from entering Lebanon, and the international community and the media placed the blame on Israel rather than Lebanon, which was preventing them from entering its territory. The UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 799, which condemned the deportations of these terrorists and demanded that Israel ensure the safe and immediate return to the occupied territories of all those deported. U.S. President George H.W. Bush's administration voted in favor of the resolution, even though it had shrugged when a year earlier in 1991, the Kuwaitis expelled 200,000 so-called Palestinians using tanks and troops. President Bush said, quote, "I think we're expecting a little much if we're asking the people in Kuwait to take kindly to those that had spied on their countrymen that were left there, that had brutalized families there, and things of that nature. Israelis, however, were supposed to take kindly to the Palestinian terrorists massacring them." The Bush administration, quote, "strongly condemned the deportations." Bill Clinton, who succeeded Bush as U.S. president, was no better. Clinton, who would soon be taking office, said, quote, "I share the anger and the frustration and the outrage of the Israeli people, and I understand how they feel. They have to deal very firmly with this group Hamas, which is apparently bent on terrorist activities of all kinds. On the other hand, I am concerned that this deportation may go too far and imperil the peace talks." Before meeting with Clinton, Yitzhak Rabin observed, quote, "We are not sure that President-elect Clinton and his team fully comprehend the danger from Islamic fundamentalism." Rabin had only temporarily deported the Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists for 2 years to improve his domestic image and buy some quiet time for peace negotiations. His coalition of leftist and far-left parties was soon divided between him and future Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres's far-left cabinet and coalition. Peres said, quote, "No one is enjoying the suffering of these people, Israel deported them, but it did not mean to hurt them. Meanwhile, Israel's leftist Meretz party called deporting Hamas, quote, a gross violation of human rights. Under pressure from the Clinton administration, which warned that it would not protect Israel from UN sanctions, and members of his own leftist coalition, Rabin offered to allow the Hamas terrorists back if they promised to, quote, desist from terror and violence for the duration of the peace negotiations. The terrorists refused to promise that, and so he agreed to take in over 100 of them immediately and the rest 1 year later. Hamas began returning to Israel in 1993. The Hamas terrorists only agreed to return due to insufficient TV coverage of their antics, with the New York Times reporting, quote, high among the reasons given by the Palestinian deportees for accepting Israel's effort to let about half of them back into the West Bank and Gaza next month was the deportees' lack not of food or shelter, but of coverage by the news media, meaning television. 30 years ago, Israel had expelled the leadership of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and then took them back in. 2 weeks after Rabin agreed to take back the Hamas terrorists, the World Trade Center in New York City was bombed by an Islamic group which, like Hamas, had come out of the Muslim Brotherhood. Rabin had warned, quote, our struggle against murderous Islamic terror is also meant to awaken the world which is lying in slumber. We call on all nations and all people to devote their attention to the real and serious danger which threatens the peace of the world in the forthcoming years. The danger of death is at our doorstep. But the world went on slumbering, and so did Israel.